I was 32 when I decided to spend the weekend at a cabin tucked away in the woods. The kind of place you don't find unless you know exactly where it is. It wasn't far from where I lived, maybe a couple hours, but far enough to feel isolated. The cabin was simple: one room, a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a large window facing the dense trees. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps itself around you, thick and almost unnatural. I had just gotten out of a messy relationship, and the idea of being alone in nature seemed like exactly what I needed to reset. The woman who had owned the cabin, Margaret, was an old friend of my parents. She had passed away a few years ago, but she had left the place to me when she died. It was the last part of her estate, and since I had nothing to do with it, I thought I might as well take a weekend to get some space. The first evening, after arriving and unpacking my stuff, I made a fire in the stove and just stared out the window. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting everything in a dusky gray. The forest around me was thick, dark, twisted trees that looked like they had been standing for centuries. I liked the isolation. I liked the feeling of being cut off from the world. But the longer I stayed, the more I began to notice the oddities. Subtle things, like the way the wind seemed to blow harder just as dusk began to settle, or how the floorboards creaked even though I was the only one there. By the second night, I was starting to feel like I wasn't alone. It wasn't like hearing footsteps behind me or seeing shadows move at the edge of my vision, but it was this constant sense that someone was just on the other side of the trees watching. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I couldn't shake it. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath. That night, I decided to walk outside. The air was crisp, but not cold, and the ground beneath my feet felt solid. I stood on the porch for a long time, looking into the woods. It was too dark to see much, but I felt something there. Something moving, hidden beneath the layers of branches and leaves. I shrugged it off, just my imagination. But then there was a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint snap of a twig breaking underfoot. Then another one, and another. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there, not daring to move, listening. The sound came closer, each step deliberate, as though whatever, was out there knew exactly where I was. It wasn't an animal. The sound was too heavy, too purposeful. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but my voice wouldn't come. The wind picked up again, and just as quickly as it started, the sound stopped. I stood still, breathless, staring into the pitch-black forest. Nothing moved. The night was quiet once more. I stayed outside for a while longer, but the feeling of being watched never left. When I finally went back inside, I bolted the door behind me. The next day was no better. I went for a hike, hoping to clear my head. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the trees packed so close together that they blocked out most of the sunlight. There was something eerie about the place, something I couldn't put my finger on. I came across a small clearing with a small creek running through it. The sound of the water was calming, but it didn't take long for that too to feel wrong. The rocks around the creek were jagged, and the trees above were gnarled in a way that looked unnatural, like something had twisted them deliberately. I didn't linger long. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I noticed something odd. The windowsill had a layer of dust on it, but there were two prints on the glass, like someone had placed their hands there and peered in. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was a bird or an animal, but the more I looked at it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that the prints were too deliberate, too human. I wiped the glass, just to be sure, but the marks remained. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to the noise from the night before, the feeling of being watched. Every little creak in the cabin made me jump. Every gust of wind made me nervous. And then I heard something else, something soft, like the rustling of cloth against the floor. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was inside the cabin. I froze, straining my ears. Came again, closer this time, like someone was moving across the room, slow, deliberate steps dragging against the floorboards. I held my breath, waiting for whatever it was to make itself known. I was sure I had locked all the doors, and yet that sound continued. I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and crept through the cabin. My heart pounded as I made my way into the kitchen. then back into the main room. There was no one there, nothing, just me and the cabin. But the sounds didn't stop. Every night after that, they continued: footsteps, soft rustling noises, the sense of something just out of sight, always there, moving just outside the range of my vision. I considered leaving, but I didn't want to be the type of person who ran. It was just in my head, right? Then one morning, I woke up to find the door to the cabin wide open. I hadn't left it that way. I know I hadn't. The feeling of being watched returned stronger than ever. But this time, it was different. There was no longer any uncertainty in it. I was no longer imagining things. Something was out there. Something was waiting for me. The last night I spent there was the worst. I was exhausted, too tired to be scared. I tried to convince myself that I had nothing to worry about, but the entire time, I felt the eyes of whatever it was, never letting up, always watching. I knew then that I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things in the dark, not caring about the time or the consequences. I left the cabin that night, locking the door behind me, and I haven't been back since. I've tried to make sense of everything that happened there, but I can't. The prints on the windowsill, the footsteps, the sense of being watched, none of it makes sense. It wasn't the wind or an animal or anything else that I can explain away. Something had been there, something living maybe, or something that used to live. I don't know, but I do know one thing for sure. I'm not going back. I'd been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. It wasn't anything fancy, just a cabin I rented up in the mountains for some peace and quiet. I needed it. Life had been stressful lately. Work was draining, the kids were loud, and my partner, Sam, had been working long hours. So when I found this small, secluded cabin in the woods, I thought it would be perfect. A chance to unwind, get away from it all, and maybe even get some time to think. The cabin was a 2-hour drive from our home in the small town of Winchester. I didn't mind the drive, though. The winding road through the forest was peaceful, with the tall trees standing like silent sentinels on either side. There was something calming about the isolation. I could already feel my tension easing as we drove deeper into the woods. Sam and I had been planning this for a while, and when we arrived, I was immediately struck by how secluded the cabin was. It was far off the beaten path, down a narrow dirt road that looked barely used. The air was crisp, the trees were thick, and I couldn't see a single neighbor for miles. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, made of dark, weathered wood with a slanted roof and a small porch. A woodpile was stacked neatly beside the cabin, and a rusty old lantern hung from the porch ceiling, swinging slightly in the wind. We unpacked the car, the air already beginning to cool as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The silence of the woods felt almost oppressive, though, and it was starting to creep me out a little. There were no sounds of animals or birds, just the wind rustling through the leaves. A few times, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone, or something, was watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling. I didn't want to ruin the trip. It was just my imagination running wild, right? We spent the first evening getting comfortable. The inside of the cabin was exactly what I had imagined, rustic, but cozy. A stone fireplace sat in the corner, and a few old wooden chairs were scattered around the room. The kitchen was small but functional, and the bathroom, though basic, was clean and well-maintained. A large window above the sink gave a clear view of the woods, and the soft glow of the setting sun painted the trees in golden light. After dinner, we sat by the fire, sipping wine and talking about life. There were no distractions, no phone signals, no internet, just us and the quiet of the mountains. The only sound was the occasional crackle of the fire and the wind outside. As the night wore on, though, the quiet began to feel heavier, like something was pushing in from the edges of the darkness. At first, I chalked it up to the isolation. I'd always been a little jumpy in quiet places, but then I started noticing things. There was a faint noise outside, barely noticeable at first. A soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the dirt. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just an animal. But as the night wore on, the sound continued. It was irregular, like something moving in a slow, methodical way. I stood up from my chair and went to the window. The woods outside were black now, and the faint moonlight barely illuminated the trees. The silence was so thick I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Nothing, no movement, no sign of what had made the noise. I closed the blinds and returned to my seat, but that feeling, something being out there, just beyond my sight, lingered. I told myself I was just being paranoid. The cabin was safe. Sam and I had made sure to lock all the windows and doors. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. By the time I went to bed, I felt restless. The bed was comfortable enough with thick blankets and soft pillows, but the second I closed my eyes, my mind wouldn't stop. I kept hearing that dragging sound again, soft at first, then louder, closer. I convinced myself it was just the wind or some animal dragging something through the brush. I tried to sleep, but the more I tried to ignore the sound, the clearer it became. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was someone moving around outside. I woke Sam, but he didn't seem bothered. "It's probably just a bear or something," he said, yawning. "You're overthinking it." I wanted to believe him, I really did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, listening to that awful sound. The next morning, I told myself I was just being paranoid. We went on a hike through the woods to get my mind off things, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig, made me jump. Couldn't relax, not fully. The woods seemed too quiet, too still, like they were waiting for something. That night, after a quiet dinner and another round of wine, I went to bed early. Sam was snoring softly beside me, but I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made my heart race. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to block out the feeling that something was creeping closer. And then I heard it again, that dragging sound. I froze, holding my breath, trying to place the noise. It was close, too close. It wasn't in the distance this time. It was right outside the cabin, just beyond the walls. The sound moved from one side of the house to the other, slow, deliberate. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Every muscle in my body tensed. I wanted to wake Sam, but I didn't. I didn't know why. I didn't want to seem crazy. I didn't want to sound like I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was outside wasn't just an animal. I tried to stay as still as possible, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. My breath came in shallow gasps. The sound continued. Then it stopped. Silence. I waited, unsure of how long. Felt like forever. But then, just as I started to relax, I heard something else. A scraping noise from the porch, then a soft thud against the door. That was enough. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. The cabin was dim, but the beam cut through the dark, revealing the faint outlines of the furniture. I crept toward the door, not daring to make a sound. Sam was still asleep, oblivious. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I turned the knob, ready to bolt if I saw anything. The door opened with a creak, and I stepped outside. The moon was barely visible through the canopy of trees, but the porch was lit enough by the cabin's light to see that nothing was there. I glanced around, the beam of my phone flashing across the yard. Nothing, just the shadows of the trees and the night air, which was cold and still. But then I saw it, a footprint in the dirt. It was small, too small for a bear, too round for any animal I knew. It looked like someone had been standing there, just out of sight, watching. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. My phone's signal was still out, and Sam was still asleep, unaware of how close we were to something that didn't belong in the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I spent the hours staring out the window, watching for any movement, listening for any sound. But nothing happened. By morning, I knew we had to leave. We packed up quickly, the air heavy with the sense that we weren't alone. I didn't say anything to Sam, though. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I couldn't stay another night. The woods felt wrong. The cabin felt wrong. We left, not looking back. The drive home was long, and the entire time I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something was still watching us. But I never went back to that cabin, and I never will, because some places aren't meant to be peaceful. Some places hold something that never lets go. And that night, I learned the hard way that the woods have their own secrets they'll never tell. I never thought a weekend in the woods would end like this. It was late fall, the kind of crisp air that made every breath feel sharp, and the ground was thick with fallen leaves. The kind of weekend where you're looking for peace, something quiet and distant from the noise of everyday life. That's exactly what I needed: solitude, to think, to just escape everything for a couple of days. The cabin I rented was small but charming. Set on the edge of a forest, it was a simple wooden structure with a stone chimney and a porch that looked out over a creek that ran quietly behind it. I'd been driving for hours through winding back roads before I found the place, feeling like I was entering some sort of forgotten corner of the world. I arrived just as the last bit of daylight faded, the orange glow of the sunset casting long shadows between the trees. When I stepped out of the car, the silence was overwhelming. No cars, no people, just the sounds of the forest around me. The rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. The cabin looked old, but in a way that felt lived in, like it had seen decades of families and weekends like mine, but still standing strong. I unpacked my things, just a bag of clothes, some food, and a few books, and settled in. The fireplace was already stacked with wood, ready to be lit. I started a fire, and soon the cabin was warm. I set up a small spot on the worn couch, cracked open a book, and let the fire's crackling be the only sound. The night was peaceful, the kind of quiet I craved. But as the darkness outside deepened, I began to feel uneasy. I couldn't pinpoint why. The house was fine, the fire was warm, but something about the stillness. It felt too still, like the world had gone to sleep and left me here alone. I shrugged it off. It was just nerves, nothing more. I spent most of the next day hiking. The woods were dense, a mix of evergreen and birch trees, their leaves already starting to fall. The air smelled like pine and earth, and the crunch of the undergrowth beneath my boots was comforting. But the further I hiked, the more I felt watched. There was no one else on the trail, but every now and then, I'd hear something. A crack, a rustle. I'd stop, listening intently, but there was nothing. I keep walking, thinking it was my mind playing tricks. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the horizon. I made myself some dinner and sat by the fire, thinking that tomorrow I'd head into town to stock up on supplies, maybe get a feel for the place. But as I sat there, I noticed something strange. The window near the front door had been slightly opened, just a crack. I was sure I'd closed it when I left. I always make sure everything is locked when I leave a place. I stood up and walked over to the window, closing it completely, checking the lock. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I hadn't shut it all the way. I returned to the couch and tried to settle down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was a subtle thing, the way the shadows seemed to linger too long, how the wind outside seemed to carry whispers. I tried to ignore it, but that knot in my gut tightened. I come here to get away from the noise of my life, but now it felt like something else was in the air, something I couldn't explain. I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would clear my head, but sleep didn't come easily. The bed was comfortable enough, and the room was dark, save for the faint glow of the fire still crackling in the other room. But as I lay there, staring up at the wooden beams above me, the sense of being watched grew stronger. It felt like someone was standing just out of sight, lurking in the dark. I rolled over, checking the shadows, but the room was still, quiet. That's when I heard it. A soft scrape, like something dragging across the floor. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was the house settling, the old wood creaking. But then it came again. A low scrape, followed by a soft thud. I sat up in bed, heart racing. My eyes scanned the room, but everything seemed normal. The door to the other room was still closed. I crept out of bed, my bare feet padding silently across the wooden floor. The fire in the other room flickered faintly through the crack beneath the door. I stood there for a moment, listening for any sound that might tell me what was going on. The air in the cabin was thick with quiet, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt like there was something behind that door. I slowly turned the knob. Nothing. The door creaked open slowly, and I stepped inside. The fire still burned, casting long shadows across the walls. The furniture was just as I had left it, undisturbed. There was no sign of anything out of place. But the window near the door was open again, wider this time. A chill ran through me. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I walked over to the window, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite process. I looked outside, but all I could see was the blackness of the forest, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. I shut the window once more and locked it, my hands shaking. I didn't know what was happening, but something was definitely off. I felt like the cabin was becoming less of a retreat and more of a trap. I decided I wouldn't stay another night. Maybe the quiet was getting to me, or maybe it was something else, but I needed to leave. I grabbed my things and started packing. I was halfway through when I heard it again, the scrape. This time it was closer. The sound was coming from the back of the cabin. I froze. The sound wasn't subtle this time. It was a heavy, deliberate scrape, like something or someone was dragging itself along the floor. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the back door, throwing it open. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the small backyard. The creek ran silently, its flow barely a murmur in the night. Nothing was there. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind spinning. I couldn't leave fast enough. I grabbed my bag and keys and ran out of the cabin, not looking back. I ran to my car, heart racing, and drove out of there as fast as I could. When I got to the nearest town, I found a place to stay for the night. I didn't care about the cost. I just needed to be away from that cabin. The next day, I contacted the rental agency to let them know what happened. They seemed surprised, but the woman on the phone didn't seem too concerned. She said the cabin was old, maybe it was just the creaking and settling I'd heard. But something about her tone made me doubt it. They never found anything out of place in the cabin. No signs of a break-in, no sign that anyone had been there. They said it was probably animals, maybe a bear or a raccoon. But the window was still locked when they checked, and I wasn't sure I believed that explanation. Whatever happened out there, I don't know. I still don't, but I never went back. I learned something during that weekend. Not all quiet places are peaceful. Some of them just hide their noise better than others. And sometimes the things we think we've left behind come with us. I never thought much about the idea of cabins in the woods. Growing up in a city, surrounded by concrete and constant noise, the notion of being alone in a secluded place never seemed too appealing. But when my cousin Kyle invited me to spend the weekend at a cabin he'd rented near the woods of Birchwood, I figured it could be a chance to escape, even if only for a couple of days. I was 24, a little too caught up in work and life, and I needed the break. It was the middle of November, and the weather was already turning cold. Kyle had said the cabin was off the beaten path, located in the middle of a small national forest a few hours out of town. The idea of being away from people seemed like a good way to recharge, even though I wasn't the type to get excited about nature. Kyle was always the outdoorsy one, the one who thrived in the quiet and solitude of the wilderness. But I wasn't really looking for peace, and I definitely wasn't interested in nature walks or anything like that. All I wanted was a few days to shut off, get some rest, and enjoy the quiet. We arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the treetops, casting everything in an orange, fading light. The cabin itself was more rustic than I expected. An old two-story building with dark, weathered wood and a small porch wrapped around the front. The area around it was dense with trees, the kind that were tall and twisted, their bark rough and gnarled. The air was cold and crisp, and there was a smell of pine mixed with the faint scent of wood smoke from a nearby chimney. It felt secluded, isolated, and that was the exact point. I couldn't help but feel a slight unease, though I told myself it was just because the setting was so unfamiliar. Kyle was excited, running around and showing me the place like it was a hidden treasure. The cabin had a living room with a large stone fireplace, and the walls were lined with shelves full of old books and mismatched furniture. A kitchen sat at the far end, the table looking like it hadn't been used in years. Upstairs was a single bedroom with a large bed, a small window looking out into the woods. Everything had a dust-covered, old-timey charm to it, as though it had been left behind for decades, waiting for us to rediscover it. After unloading our bags, Cal started a fire in the hearth, and we spent the evening eating takeout and talking about random things. Mostly the things we missed about the city, about our childhood, and about life in general. I wasn't too worried about anything out of the ordinary at that point. The night was uneventful, and the cabin was warm and inviting, especially with the fire crackling in the fireplace. But as the night wore on and the warmth of the fire started to fade, I began to notice something strange. A silence that was different from the usual kind. It wasn't the peace of nature, but something heavy, almost suffocating. The wind had picked up outside, making the trees creak and groan as they swayed. The howling of the wind seemed to echo through the stillness of the cabin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't entirely alone. It was just the two of us, but the house felt old, as though it had stories to tell. And I didn't think I wanted to hear them. I figured it was just the isolation getting to me. It's easy to get worked up when you're alone in unfamiliar places, right? I dismissed the feeling and tried to push it out of my head, but it kept coming back, like a creeping shadow that I couldn't ignore. There was something about the way the wind blew against the windows, how the house seemed to settle and creak with every gust, that made the place feel alive in a way. Cal noticed me fidgeting a little, but he didn't think anything of it. He was busy making another drink and laughing at something on the TV. I envied him for being so carefree. It wasn't that I was scared, but something didn't feel right. We decided to head to bed early, both of us ready to sleep off the long day. The bed upstairs was comfortable enough, though it smelled faintly of mildew and dust. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the moon filtering through the small window. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the wind howling outside. But as the minutes ticked by, something shifted in the air. The sounds of the wind started to sound closer, like it was no longer just outside the house. It was as if the house itself was groaning, complaining under the weight of something. I kept hearing faint tapping noises from somewhere upstairs, coming from behind the walls. It was rhythmic, almost as if someone or something was tapping on the wood. I turned over, trying to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling, just old wood and cold air causing the noises. But as the night stretched on, the sounds got louder. I could hear footsteps, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind anymore. These were distinct, methodical, deliberate steps, pacing back and forth in the attic above the room where we slept. My heart started racing, and I sat up in bed, my breath shallow. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my hands gripping the blankets. I knew Kyle wouldn't hear it, even if I called out to him. The sound was too faint, too far away, and I didn't want to risk waking him. So I just sat there, frozen in place, waiting for the sound to stop. But it didn't. Instead, it grew louder. The tapping turned into a thumping, followed by a dragging sound, as though something heavy was being moved across the attic floor. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening, but I couldn't. I had to get up and check. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The silence seemed louder now, the creaking of the house and the wind outside almost deafening. The stairs creaked as I made my way down to the living room, heart pounding in my chest. The feeling that something wasn't right gripped me tightly, and the air felt thick with dread. Something wasn't normal here. I took a flashlight from the small table by the door and crept up the stairs toward the attic. The trapdoor was old, its edges splintered with age. I hesitated for a moment, my hand shaking as I reached for the rusted handle. But I had to know. The sounds weren't stopping. I had to check. My mind was filled with the worst possibilities, but none of them made sense. I turned the handle and pulled the door open, shining my light inside. The attic was empty, the beams covered in dust and old furniture draped with sheets. There was no sign of anything unusual, no reason for the noise. I felt a strange sense of relief, but also an overwhelming sense of confusion. What had I heard? I closed the trapdoor carefully, my thoughts racing. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe the old house was just making sounds on its own, settling as the night went on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in there, something I wasn't meant to find. It wasn't until I went back to bed and lay under the covers again that I heard the sounds once more. They started faint, a slow, dragging movement. But this time, the noise was coming from below me. Not above, not in the attic. It was from beneath the floor, deep in the earth, as though something had started digging its way up through the dirt, through the foundation. I felt my stomach twist in panic, but I couldn't move. I lay frozen, heart hammering in my chest. The sounds grew louder, closer, until they stopped right below my bed. For a moment, there was nothing. Complete, suffocating silence. Then a knock came from underneath the floorboards. One knock, then another, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, holding my breath, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin. I couldn't make sense of it, but I knew something was wrong. By morning, the sounds had stopped. I didn't mention it to Kyle. He would have laughed it off as nothing, just the house settling. But I knew better. We packed up and left that morning, neither of us saying much. I drove us back home, not looking back at Birchwood. Not once. The cabin had been quiet when we left, but I felt it. I felt its eyes on me, waiting for my return. It wasn't the house that scared me, but what had lived inside it long before we ever arrived. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Maybe they wouldn't have believed me, or maybe they would have just thought I was paranoid. But I knew. I knew what I had heard. I knew what had been beneath the floorboards, and I knew I wasn't going back. The drive up to the cabin was longer than I had expected. The winding roads through the dense forest made the ride feel endless, and as the sun started to dip behind the trees, a cold, unsettling feeling crept over me. I had rented the cabin for the weekend, hoping to get away from the noise of the city and spend some quiet time alone. No phone service, no distractions, just me, nature, and the isolation I thought I craved. The cabin itself was tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. I had rented it from a small, family-owned business that claimed the place was perfect for a peaceful retreat. The pictures on the website looked idyllic. A cozy log cabin, nestled beside a calm lake, surrounded by tall trees. I hadn't thought twice when booking it. The owner had assured me there was no need to worry, and that everything was well maintained. By the time I arrived, it was dark, and the last traces of sunlight were fading. I pulled up the gravel driveway, the tires crunching beneath me as I parked in front of the small wooden structure. The cabin was silent, with no signs of life anywhere around it. The windows were dark, and the door stood ajar, as if waiting for me. I grabbed my bag from the car, shivering a little in the cool evening air, and stepped inside. The interior smelled of wood and dust, old but not unpleasant. The main room was dimly lit by a single lamp on a small table, and the place had an eerie, abandoned feel. The furniture was simple. An old couch, a couple of armchairs, a fireplace. I placed my things down on the floor and took a moment to look around. There was a kitchen to the side with a small dining table. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but most of the books looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The one thing that caught my eye was the window in the far corner, facing out toward the lake. It was strange how quiet everything felt. The usual sounds of the woods, rustling leaves, distant animal calls were absent. Instead, there was just a profound stillness. I shrugged off the feeling and settled in. The cabin had an old-fashioned charm, and I figured I could get used to the quiet. I unpacked my things, making myself comfortable for the night. The plan was simple. Stay in, relax, read a book, maybe have some dinner. I'd gotten everything I needed before coming here, so I wasn't planning to leave again until the weekend was over. As the night dragged on, I started to feel more and more uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air inside the cabin felt heavier than it should, and the darkness outside the windows seemed deeper than I had anticipated. At one point, I heard a small sound from upstairs, like something shifting or scraping against the floor. It could have been the house settling, but I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. I decided to ignore it, heading into the kitchen to prepare dinner. I had just started heating up some canned soup when the power flickered, then went out completely, leaving the cabin in pitch-black darkness. My heart skipped a beat. I'd assumed the cabin had modern utilities, but now, in the dark, I realized just how isolated I was. I groped around for a flashlight, my hands trembling a little as I finally found it in my bag. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the walls and the cluttered kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was enough for me to feel somewhat safer. I walked over to the window, curious to see if anything had changed outside. The faint light from the flashlight caught something at the edge of the forest, the outline of a figure, standing perfectly still among the trees. I blinked, convinced it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked again, the figure was still there. Tall, almost unnaturally so, and completely motionless. Could have been a shadow or an animal, but it didn't feel like it. Felt wrong. I stepped back from the window, my heart racing. My mind spun with possibilities, most of them unsettling. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination or the dim light playing tricks on me, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I had read enough stories about isolated places to know that weird things could happen when you were far from civilization. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but my mind kept wandering. The quiet in the cabin felt heavier now, almost suffocating. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the wind outside, made me jump. I hadn't even noticed how late it had gotten until I checked the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. I hadn't heard any sounds from outside in a while, and the figure by the trees had long since disappeared. Maybe I was just overthinking things. It was probably just a person hiking in the woods, or some animal that I had mistaken for something else. Either way, I needed to get some rest. I decided to go to bed. The upstairs bedroom was just as simple as the rest of the cabin. A small bed with a thick quilt, an old dresser, and a single window looking out over the woods. I climbed under the covers, trying to push the strange feeling from my mind. I thought about the figure outside, but eventually, I drifted off into a restless sleep. I'd been driving for hours, the winding roads becoming more desolate with every mile. The trees lining the edges of the road were thick and overgrown, almost like they were closing in. I could see the sun beginning to set in the distance, the orange glow peeking through the branches, casting long shadows on the asphalt. I turned the wheel sharply as the GPS guided me onto a narrow dirt road. The cabin was supposed to be hidden away in the woods, a perfect retreat for a few days of solitude. I needed to get away. My mind was cluttered, and I hadn't been able to think straight in weeks. The city felt suffocating, and this cabin, out in the middle of nowhere, seemed like the perfect place to reset. The engine rumbled as I sped along the rough road, my tires kicking up dust. My headlights were the only light, slicing through the growing darkness. As I passed a few bends, I saw no other signs of life. No houses, no cars, just endless trees. I couldn't even hear the faint hum of distant civilization. It was eerie, but somehow calming. Eventually, I reached a small clearing, and the cabin appeared in front of me. It was older than I had imagined, with its wooden exterior weathered by time. The porch was cluttered with old furniture, and the windows were dark, like eyes staring out at me, waiting. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I shook it off. It was just an old house, nothing to be afraid of. I parked the car and grabbed my bag from the passenger seat. The sound of gravel crunched beneath my feet as I walked up the steps. The door creaked open with a force that made me pause for a second. But when I stepped inside, I felt the warm embrace of the cabin's stillness. There was an undeniable feeling of isolation here, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was quiet, like the kind of peace you only get when you're completely alone. The air smelled of pine and wood with a hint of must. The interior was rustic, but in a way that made it charming. A stone fireplace stood in the center of the living room, its hearth empty and cold. Old furniture dotted the space. An armchair with faded upholstery, a coffee table covered in dust, and a bookshelf filled with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The windows were covered with thick curtains, and I opened them to let in the last light of the day. The cabin was small but cozy. A small kitchen connected to the living room with a table set for two. I set my bag on the table and looked around. It was quiet, too quiet, but that was what I wanted. I could already feel my muscles relaxing. I decided to light the fireplace, even though it wasn't cold enough yet. There was something comforting about the flickering flames. As the fire started crackling, I unpacked my things: clothes, a couple of books, and my journal. I sat in the armchair by the fire, the warmth spreading through my body as I opened my journal and began to write. But as I wrote, I felt an unease that I couldn't explain. The cabin, while beautiful in its solitude, felt like it was watching me, not in a supernatural way, but in a way that suggested I wasn't the only one who had ever been here. It was subtle, like the space had its own history, and I was just another chapter in it. I shook it off and focused on the words in front of me. The night dragged on slowly. The fire flickered and popped, casting strange shadows around the room. Eventually, I decided to head to bed. The bedroom was simple, with a large wooden bed covered in a thick quilt. I climbed in, still thinking about the strange feeling that seemed to follow me. I lay there for a while, listening to the wind howling outside. The trees rustled, and the cabin creaked. But nothing unusual happened. I closed my eyes and let myself drift into sleep. At around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. It wasn't the wind that woke me, nor the noise of the house settling. No, it was something else. Something that felt wrong. I sat up, my heart racing, listening to the silence. The darkness in the room felt thick, oppressive. I scanned the room, my eyes darting around the shadows, but nothing was there. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the isolation getting to me. I lay back down, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It lingered, like an unseen presence. Then I heard it, a faint noise, like something scraping against the floor. It was coming from the living room. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The noise stopped. Silence. I waited for a few moments, then cautiously got out of bed. My bare feet made no sound as I tiptoed to the door. I opened it slowly, careful not to make a noise. My pulse was loud in my ears as I stepped into the hallway, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The living room was just ahead, and as I approached, I felt that nagging feeling in my gut again. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. I crept into the living room, my eyes scanning every corner. Everything looked normal, no furniture moved, no strange shadows. But as I turned to head back to my room, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The window next to the door had been opened, just a crack. I was certain I had closed it earlier. I rushed over and shut it tightly, locking the latch. My hands were shaking. My mind was racing. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But then, as I turned around, I saw it. A shadow moved across the far wall. I froze again, heart pounding. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was something or someone. I backed away slowly, reaching for the fireplace poker as a weapon. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I had to stay calm. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the movement. And then it happened. A loud bang, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. I spun around to see the kitchen door swinging open. I hesitated. This wasn't normal. The cabin was empty. It was supposed to be empty, but something inside me told me I wasn't alone anymore. I always thought the idea of being out in the woods, alone in a cabin, would be peaceful. A break from the noise of the world. Time to reflect, to disconnect and find some clarity. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, just me and my thoughts. I needed to get away, even if just for a couple of days. I rented a small cabin in the middle of nowhere, tucked deep into the Appalachian foothills. The weather was cold, but it wasn't unbearable. It was late fall, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The leaves had mostly fallen by the time I arrived, and the trees stood bare, their branches scratching the sky like long, crooked fingers. The cabin itself was old, rustic, a weathered structure made from logs that had aged over decades. It was more isolated than I expected. No neighbors, no other cabins around, just the long road leading up to it and the quiet stretch of wilderness in every direction. I had been given clear instructions about the area. There was a small town about 45 minutes away, but nothing in between, just miles of forest. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how alone I really was. The caretaker had given me a key, a brief warning about the area's wildlife, and a quick run-through of the essentials. Firewood, a first aid kit, water, and the emergency number for the local sheriff. Nothing too concerning. At least, nothing that should have set off alarm bells in my head. But something felt off as soon as I entered the cabin. A strange heaviness in the air. Maybe it was just the silence. No hum of traffic or distant voices. Only the wind rustling the leaves outside and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The inside of the cabin was modest, wood floors, a stone fireplace with a few charred logs still smoldering, and a kitchen with just the basics. A stove, a sink, and a small table. I unpacked my things and set up for the night, trying to shake off the weird feeling gnawing at me. The bed was in a corner near the window, and I noticed the curtains were drawn, giving the room an almost claustrophobic feel, like the outside world didn't exist. As the sun began to set, I tried to ignore the unease crawling under my skin. The wind picked up, and the sound of it rattling against the cabin walls added to the atmosphere of isolation. It was beautiful in its own way, but also unnerving. I built a fire, settled into an old armchair, and grabbed a book I'd been meaning to read. The crackling of the fire, the creaking of the floorboards. It all felt a bit too real, but I chalked it up to the isolation, the silence, and the fact that I wasn't used to being so far away from everything. That night, I went to bed early. I wasn't tired, but the quiet was beginning to weigh on me. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the room in darkness except for the soft glow of the fading light from the fireplace. As I lay there, staring up at the wooden beams in the ceiling, I heard something faint, a sound. It was so subtle at first that I dismissed it as the wind or the house settling, but then it came again, this time more distinct. A soft, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the floor. I froze. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, or if it was just my imagination running wild in the stillness. I sat up slowly, listening. The sound came again, this time closer. Dragging, scraping. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. I turned the lamp on beside my bed, and the light flickered on, casting long shadows in every corner of the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The cabin looked as it should, but the sound continued. It wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. It was coming from the floor, just beyond the edge of my bed. I held my breath. It stopped for a moment, and the silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Then, suddenly, a loud thud, like something heavy had dropped in the next room. I shot up, heart hammering in my chest. The cabin was dead quiet, except for my rapid breathing. I was almost afraid to move, but I had to check. Slowly, I crept out of bed and padded to the door of the small bedroom. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, but I refused to let fear control me. The worst thing would be to stand there, paralyzed, imagining monsters in the shadows. I opened the door, cautiously stepping out into the main room. It was cold, the kind of cold that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The fire had almost gone out completely, leaving the room dark except for the soft light of the embers in the fireplace. I checked the corners, the windows, the shadows. Nothing. Then I heard it again, the dragging sound. It was coming from the far end of the room, near the door to the small storage closet. I approached slowly, my footsteps nearly inaudible on the wooden floor. The closet door was cracked open, and I could see something inside, something small and dark. My stomach twisted, and I knew then that I wasn't just hearing things. I took another step closer, my hand reaching for the door. My fingers brushed the cool wood of the door frame, and my pulse raced. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Inside the closet, there was nothing at all, just an empty space, except for a small object that seemed out of place. A dark, stained rag, half hidden behind an old blanket. It was lying in a pool of something dark, wet. My mind raced. What was that? Why hadn't I seen it earlier? Why did it look so wrong? I felt a sudden cold rush, and I stepped back, instinctively turning to leave the closet. But before I could, I heard another sound, this time from behind me, a soft, shuffling footstep. My head snapped around. In the dark, near the far corner of the room, I saw something moving, a shadow, barely noticeable, barely more than a blur against the dim light of the dying fire. I stood frozen. It didn't move quickly, but it was coming closer. My eyes couldn't focus fast enough. I didn't know if I was imagining it, but I couldn't take my eyes off the corner. It moved slow, deliberate steps just out of view. Whatever it was, it wasn't human. It was too quiet, too fluid in its movement, like something that wasn't quite solid. I turned to run, but as soon as I moved, the sound stopped. Everything went dead silent. The world outside the cabin, the wind in the trees, everything disappeared. It was as if the entire forest had held its breath. I sprinted back to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. My pulse was pounding in my ears, my heart slamming against my ribs. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to calm my breathing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't until the sun rose that I finally worked up the courage to leave my bed. By then, I was exhausted, mentally drained from a night of terrifying uncertainty. I grabbed my phone to check the time, but when I turned it on, I noticed something strange. There were no signal bars, no connection, nothing. The unease from the night before didn't lift as I gathered my things and started to leave. I checked the cabin one last time, double-checking every corner, every nook. There was no sign of anything, no trace of the strange shadow or the dragging sound. But as I stepped out onto the porch to leave, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the dirt just beyond the cabin steps, was a trail of footprints, leading straight to the cabin. They were large, heavy, and uneven, as if whoever or whatever had been following me had been dragging something behind them. I didn't wait around to figure out who or what had left them. I got in my car, started the engine, and didn't look back. I drove all the way back to the nearest town, feeling every inch of the road beneath me, every turn as if my life depended on it. And I never went back to that cabin.